Year-round real food. How do we grow it, pick it, prepare it, and store it so that we have the real stuff all year round? That's the deal. We've talked a little bit about body fuel. How do you store and preserve nutrition? Because at the very tippy top is the biogenic, or the living, the sprouts, the pre-digested. Now that doesn't sound real good to me, but digested with bacteria or enzymes, tempeh and miso. The bioactive, or alive, raw, fermented kraut. And incidentally, that fermented cabbage has more food value than the cabbage did. Dehydrated below 104 degrees to maintain the enzymes. A quick lesson in digestive processes: you deconjugate an egg when you cook it. It goes from an egg to a scrambled egg or a hard-boiled egg. You denature the protein. For the body, when you eat that, the body has to reform those enzymes to be able to use the food value from the egg. I'm not sure. There are some people who advocate raw eggs instead of cooked eggs. I'd rather have raw plants instead of cooked plants, because I'm less afraid of what I might get from them. And then there's mineralized food. 4 to 582 times the nutrition. Raw, frozen, dehydrated. Freeze-dried, I understand, has 94% of the original nutrients. That's why I'm so interested in the subject of freeze-drying on a home basis. Dehydrated. We bought a dehydrator. It's about 30 inches wide and about 30 inches long and about 36 inches tall, and you can put a whole bushel of stuff in there. And it'll dehydrate it up really good, and then you store it in the absence of oxygen, and it will last a whole long time. Whole food, 400% the required nutrients. Cooking reduces nutrients by 80%, destroys the enzymes. Organic will have about 88%, depending on who you read, who grew it. A lot of ours comes from China. Processed food, refined, is at or below the recommended daily allowance. And then there's that junk food. I even wonder if we should call it food, that has less than the recommended daily amount. Sprouts, long recognized as superfoods because they have high protein, enzymes, vitamins, and minerals. The nutrient density is highest 5 to 9 days after germination. It's real interesting to me. Ken Rolla of Fresh and Alive, immediately when he got the news that Fukushima Daiichi was occurring, he ordered $2,000 worth of sprouting seeds. Because when you don't have sunshine, you don't have anything else, you can eat sprouts, and they're very, very nutritious for you. And you don't have to worry about contamination or any of those other things. $2,000 worth. Broccoli sprouts contain up to 5,000% more of the sulforaphane than fresh broccoli from the store. Those are the things that have the protective qualities in broccoli. Proteins, vitamins, enzymes, and minerals multiply from 3 to 12 times in sprouts. Super sprouts could help reduce cancer risk. A study by the University of Ulster eating just over 100 grams of tasty sprouted vegetables. Now, how many grams are in an ounce? For us conversionally challenged, there are 28 grams in an ounce, I think, somewhere right in there. So this is little less than 4 ounces of sprouts. Not a whole lot. Every day for a month has been shown to have clear protective effects against DNA damage in human blood cells. DNA damage is associated with cancer risk. Sources of DNA damage include diet-related carcinogens. That charcoal broiled steak has more carcinogens in it than that whole pack of cigarettes. Bodily processes like oxidative stress, the raw sprouts protect against this type of damage. And just a portion, 113 grams per day of a mix of broccoli, radish, alfalfa, and clover sprouts was enough in our test to show the protective effect. You don't want cancer? Hey, eat sprouts. You might like it. 10 reasons to sprout. Up to 100 times more enzymes in sprouts than uncooked fruits and vegetables. The quality of protein in the beans, nuts, seeds, and grains improves when it's sprouted. Nuts, I didn't know that. Beans, so you sprout it, you dehydrate it, you eat it, you're better off. The fiber content increases substantially through sprouting. The vitamin content increases dramatically. Essential fatty acid content increases. Minerals bind to the protein in the seed, grain, nut, or bean, making them more usable in the body. Sprouts are the ultimate locally grown food. Yes, I'd say so. Whether it's a quart jar with a mesh lid on it that you rinse out every day or whatever. The energy contained in the seed, grain, nut, or legume is ignited through soaking and sprouting. Sprouts are alkalinizing. Disease does not occur in an alkaline environment. And sprouts are inexpensive. Considering the food value that you get, they're probably the most inexpensive superfood. You can get really fancy sprouting things that have little trays and have automatic waterers and all this stuff. This one has 2 trays of alfalfa, some wheatgrass, some sunflowers. I love mung bean sprouts. Here's some sprouting resources. Mum's Sprouting Seeds is a company in Canada. They do a good job of supplying organic sprouting seeds. Steve Merowitz, known as the Sprout Man, has written a bunch of different books on sprouting. Eat Sprouts and sprouting.com are a good sources. There's a survivalspot.com ultimate sprouting guide. That's a really good one. And I use kelp or seaweed extract and biology on my sprouts to make sure I'm getting the maximum nutrient content. So as we go down from sprouts, what about pollen? What is predigested food? Enzymes or bacteria have started the digestive process for us. Raw, ripe, mineralized, heirloom, fermented, freeze-dried, dehydrated, and then whole food. Above that line, that whole food has more than 4 times the recommended daily allowance of nutrients. And then below that, incidentally, optimally processed conventional produce has more nutrients than poorly grown organic produce. So you need to be very careful of your production and how things are grown. Steamed, poorly grown organic, poorly mineralized, lacking water, that's hot, and then canned, processed, and junk, getting us way on down the amount of food value that we get. So if I'm going to grow year-round, what is my focus going to be on? My first focus is going to be sprouts, because that's the highest nutrient density. And I would encourage you to become adept at sprouting. Various seeds and various sprouts have various tastes and qualities to them. Learn to enjoy the qualities of a variety of sprouts, and you'll get far more nutrition that way. And then after the biogenic or the alive are the bioactive. They have been alive, fall, winter, and spring vegetables. Now, living in the southeast of the United States, unless we're at a high altitude or elevation, we don't have to worry. We can grow some of the most nutritious crops right along through the winter without any covering. So I would encourage you to start growing and then branch out in the fall. And if you get the right, oh, by the way, I have magenta lamb's quarters. Lamb's quarters have more nutrients in them than spinach. It's a weed, but the magenta is a pretty weed. It has a purple, reddish color on the stem of the leaf, and it grows like a weed, and it has plenty of food value, so I'm for it, and I have a lot of them coming up. And then after that, you can look at a hoop house. I have friends that have 50-cent tomatoes right now, today, in a hoop house, growing. Then you can use a frost blanket. The frost blanket, you cover it, it'll keep pests out, and it will rain through it, but the condensation will form on the inside, and the freezing can form a protective layer of air so that it will stand and be more cold hardy. And then there's greenhouse plastic that you can put on to keep the cold air from going through it. If you really live in the north and you like off-season vegetables, what is an off-season vegetable? I was doing a growing class down in Chattanooga one day, and somebody raised their hand and said, "Oh, can you grow pineapples here?" My answer was, absolutely you can grow pineapples here, but it'll be the most expensive pineapple you've ever eaten. You can do anything, but understand that as I get older, I don't have to have off-tasting tomatoes to be happy in January. I can do without those tomatoes, and I can savor the taste of the tomato to come. But there is a solar earth-burned greenhouse. There is an underground greenhouse. There's a book about it. That if you want to know about a greenhouse and you live in Wisconsin, that's where the guy lived that had the solar earth-burned greenhouse down in the ground. You can eat produce from your root cellar. We're going to talk about what sort of produce you put into storage. But you can have a root cellar, you can have dry storage for onions, garlic, squash, etc. And you can use succession planting. You can plant corn here, and 2 weeks later you can plant more corn, and 2 weeks, and you can have, instead of one crop of corn, you can have 2 months worth of corn if you plant it outright, or whatever you're growing. And then you can plant different varieties that will have different ripening successions. My dad had on his nightstand a list of peaches, pears, and blueberries and raspberries in order of ripening succession. So you plant one variety for early apple, you plant another for summer apple, one for late, one for fall, and one for storage. And you have apples most of the year just naturally through your succession of ripening and the various crops. This is in a hoop house in December. You can see the crops growing right along, and you can easily eat. Here's a earth-bermed greenhouse with squash. She's watering the beds in the greenhouse. Here's a cold frame. You don't have to go all out. What's the temperature of the soil? Usually between 55 and 58 degrees. It will vary a little bit. But if you put that planting down in the soil, protect it from the wind, it'll grow. You better make sure it's vented because it will cook on the sunshiny days. Here's one with an open lid and the top that you lift up to get the heat out of there. So, 10 tips for preserving fresh produce and retaining nutrients. The first one is don't wash it right away. A good cook doesn't want washed produce. They want to wash their own when they get ready. You need to restrict the moisture loss. That's fine, but you don't need to wash it. Pack it loosely and separate produce. I thought I knew how to put lettuce away, and I would wash it in acid water to kill anything on it, rinse it with alkaline water, and then put it in the crisper in a bag. And where it touched the plastic bag, after a couple of weeks, it began to turn yucky. And then I began to watch Jill. She took that same head of lettuce and she tore each leaf off. And she washed each leaf separately, sort of dried it, and then put it flat over some paper towels to collect the moisture. And her lettuce would stay twice as long as mine. And she wasn't even using an ethylene oxide bag. Buy local. Know your grower. Know how he grows. Grab from the front, not the back. Now, you need to be careful of your supplier. They may be conscientious and they may put the new stuff on the back. If that's the case, you can grab from the back. But most of us are lazy and we need to grab from the front because that's where the new stuff's going to be. If you can't eat it right away, buy it frozen. Because once that plant is picked, severed from the roots, it will lose 50% of its nutrition in the first week. That's why you want to grow your own and go pick your own right out there and eat it. Maybe I like breakfast in the raspberry patch myself. Buy young, store intact, buy mushrooms exposed to light, think twice about cooking, and drink fresh juices immediately. They oxidize so quickly. Everything we do with food is an attempt to keep from being poisoned by our microbial competitors. They start in, so what do? As we process, freeze drying would be the best because it retains 94% of the nutrients. Fermenting, kefir, kombucha, and cultured vegetables, sauerkraut. Dehydrating below 104 degrees, it sacrifices some enzymes. Freezing. Now, I want frozen corn, frozen peaches, frozen peas, because I think the taste is better. Understand, though, that requires continuing power to keep it frozen. So if you don't have power, what do? You eat the stuff in the freezer first. Either eat it up or can it up, whichever, to preserve it, because it's not going to be good for long. Canning sacrifices nutrition, but no power is needed. Once you get it canned, it'll stay there for probably several years, although you'll want to turn it over and rotate it. How do you select food to be stored? Number one, I want mineralized produce. I want the full nutrient density. I want to be very careful in my harvesting. I want perfect produce. It's going to spoil, you remember what we just read, anyway. So I want perfect produce. I don't want scratched, dented, whatever. And then I want to prepare it with either food-grade hydrogen peroxide or apple cider vinegar or Kangen strong acid water. That will kill any microorganisms on the outside of it and get it ready to store. Now, in Monticello, Jefferson wrote, when we were at Monticello, we went into one of the root cellars, and there were drawers in the bottom of the root cellar. And I thought, well, what in the world's that for? And what they did is every fall, they gathered the fresh maple leaves and lined those wooden drawers with maple leaves, a layer of apples, more maple leaves, because those dry leaves would suck up the moisture from any deteriorating produce, and that one bad apple won't spoil the whole drawer full if you do it that way. Apples, pears, tomatoes, peppers, cabbage, beets, any of your root vegetables you can put in sand. In a dark bucket in sand. You can put them in the back of your root cellar. Beets, turnips, carrots. There are various storage requirements for various fresh vegetables. Group 1 is 32 to 41 degrees and 85 to 95% humidity. That includes beet greens, lettuce, Swiss chard, mustard greens, collard spinach, green onions, turnip greens, and kale. All the greens, very cool and very humid. Then, in a crisper separate from the above vegetables, asparagus, cabbage, limas, rhubarb, turnips, sweet corn, mushrooms, carrots, beets, broccoli, cauliflower, peas, Brussels sprouts, celery, and radishes. And then 45 to 55 degrees and 85 to 90% humidity, bell peppers, hot peppers, cucumbers, ripe melons, snap beans, and summer squash. The third group, 50 to 60 degrees, eggplant, okra, tomatoes, sweet potatoes, and Irish potatoes. And then 65 to 70 degrees and out of direct sunlight, garlic, melons, dry onions, and tomatoes. Various storage. My dad used to tell me you can keep sweet potatoes just fine in the cupboard up on the rack in your closet, dry, just don't let them freeze. Now, I would add one thing to that. Don't turn them over until you're ready to cook them, because the sugar will settle in that sweet potato. When you turn it over, it starts to go the other way and it ends up rotting. Storage consideration. Most everything will store better from a standpoint of lasting without oxygen. To do that, you put it in plastic or mylar, and you would either use dry ice, which will produce carbon dioxide, or oxygen absorbers. Now let's talk about that. Let's say that I have 5 gallons of non-GM cornmeal. To maintain the nutrient of a ground whatever, I need to freeze it. Okay? I should put something in there to take the oxygen out, but you don't use 5 gallons of cornmeal at any given time. You would open it and you would expose it to oxygen right off the bat, or lentils or pinto beans or whatever. I would suggest you put them in you buy smaller oxygen absorbers, put them in smaller containers, and open that small container and use from it. That way, when you open your whole can, you don't introduce oxygen into all of it. To prevent insects from their damage, bay leaves are very effective. You can use diatomaceous earth, which will chop up the insects' insides, and you can freeze whatever it is. If you have Chinese chestnuts and they naturally grow, when they fall off the tree, you need to freeze them. If not, the worms will start eating right away, and you won't end up with anything except, oh, by the way, what's worse than biting into an apple and seeing a worm? Biting into an apple and seeing half a worm. So if you don't want to see half a worm, you need to prevent it in some way or other. Care of stored food, good temperature, out of the sunlight and out of air, and long-term cold storage. You need to rotate, but you can keep things for years if you do it correctly. A root cellar can be something so complex as a buried garbage can or a separate building in a bank. You can have warm, dry, dry, cool, and moist, cool. And there are a lot of resources that you can use to good advantage as you look at how to store, what to store, how to get the most food value. And Pickle It, pickle, P-I-C-K-L -IT, has the spouts to let off the gas from pickling and fermentation. Be a good student and learn and focus on where you want to go with your dietary regimen.